The third Neptunia Rebirth game has hit the Switch in Asia, completing the trilogy, but not without some weird glitches on the Switch too. Let's dive right in. Here is my review of Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth 3 V Generation for the Nintendo Switch and backwards compatible with Nintendo Switch 2. This game is a direct sequel to Rebirth 2, where Neptune is sucked into another dimension and meets Plutia, a brand new Planeptune CPU. The two try to find a way to send Neptune home, while evil forces are working to create a world where CPUs are no longer wanted, a reference and parody of the dynamic of console gaming versus PC gaming. As a story, I think it's good for the most part. The villain doesn't have a lot of charm, but she's weaved into the themes of the plot well, and it's the most meta Neptunia has ever been. It's also a bit grittier and more mature with its dialogue and themes. Iratar's personality and really just everything about her, along with the fact that the game is a lot more flagrant with profanity. These two factors, mostly Iris Heart, are what I believe ended up flagging these games in Nintendo's new content policies to not be localized in North America and Europe. Moving on to gameplay, this is a 3D RPG mixing turn-based and action elements, just like Rebirths 1 and 2. Which makes sense considering the entire trilogy was CompileHeart taking the Neptunia victory formula and remaking all three original games with it. To start this off, this release includes almost all DLC built in. Characters, items, dungeons, all of that can be toggled from the title screen. Just like Rebirths 1 and 2, and just like the PS4 Rebirth trilogy that recently came out in the West, the only DLC that was excluded is the survival mode for the Colosseum. With the gameplay formula, Rebirth 1 and 2 made very little changes between them, mostly in party size and Stella's dungeon being introduced in the second game. While Rebirth 3 has the same loop of a 2D world map, towns for guilds, side quests, and shops, and chirper NPCs for you to talk to every chapter, it makes a lot of small changes to the formula to feel similar, but very different. Many of the dungeons and enemies are still copy-pasted assets from the earlier games, but they've added in-game achievements to increase character stats. Stella's dungeon is much more streamlined and simplified, especially if you activate the 1 second per floor DLC. You can expand attack combos to 4 per round instead of 3, and they completely changed the SP system for skills and EXE drive. So let's go into combat where most of the changes took place. It's still turn-based with free roam around arenas to set up your attacks on your turn, but SP is no longer just used for skills. HDD transformations, skills, and EXE attacks all use the SP gauge. The EXE gauge is no longer a thing where you can simply use items to refill it instead of having to grind battle after battle to get one cinematic skill available. The downside are the human characters. Pretty much only the CPUs have EXE skills now, linked to who else is in the party with them or coupled with them in the Lily system. Characters like Falcom, IF, and the rest have an awakening feature that is basically their version of HDD giving them stat boosts, but many of them simply cannot do those big cinematic finishers they could before, having it be something only the CPUs have access to. It is true that all of the human characters are DLC, but even in Rebirth 1 and 2, all of its DLC characters had access to EXE drive cinematics. In Rebirth 3, only Broccoli has an EXE drive skill. The rest of the humans don't. Now, I do like the system. It lets you use the skills much more often when you can use one of the big ones like HDD Neptune or Guardian Force to put a giant hit onto a boss's health bar, and then use items on the other characters to pop it back up and do it again. I just wish that the human characters still had access to it. Another change is a much more balanced difficulty with break and DLC characters. Bosses are more tanky, incentivizing you to set up builds for break attacks to get that stamina broken, and the DLC characters aren't as crazy overpowered. Characters like Histoire or Child IF will be crazy strong as soon as you get them, but by the late game, the main characters like Neptune and Plutia will have easily passed them, leaving those overpowered characters sometimes even weaker than the default ones. The only downsides I have to say about Rebirth 3 are the excessive amount of chirper NPCs and the world map. In every chapter, you get an overabundance of chirper events to cycle through for plans and sometimes items for the true ending, and it gets a little repetitive. This ties into the world map system as well. It's cool to have a much larger world map this time around, around, with each nation getting its own map screen. But with you not knowing where a dungeon is until you've entered the nation where it's located, it gets tedious to load into a nation, load the world map, load another nation, and repeat. Especially when working on the true ending where you'll be constantly unlocking new dungeons and not being told where they are. Getting to content and link, there is a lot to do here. Like my replays of Rebirth 1 and 2, I watched and listened to all of the English dubbed scenes and skipped most of the others. With that in mind, I completed the game in around 22 hours total. If I'd never played the game before, it would be closer to 35 hours. It also has a decently long post-game with a bunch of extra dungeons and areas instead of going straight to New Game Plus. Then we get to presentation. Visually, it's like the other games. Very colorful and smooth for the most part. A few jaggies here and there on the Switch, but even on the original platform, it looks nice and colorful. Performance, on the other hand, we have a lot to talk about. Frame rate is similar to Rebirth 2, but a bit less stable this time. Pretty much all of the game on the Switch 1 is filled with stutters and drops into the 20s. It's playable with the combat being turn-based, and walking in a straight line does flow pretty decently once you're in a dungeon after about 10 seconds. But you should expect to very rarely get a stable 30 FPS on the original Switch. Playing this on the Switch 2 does utilize the unlocked frame rate to shoot up to 60 FPS, though it is also less stable. I never saw the frames drop underneath 30 on the Switch 2, but it definitely is not 60 the whole time. Some fights make it very apparent that the FPS was jumping between 30 and 60 quite a bit. It's still enjoyable and doesn't really feel choppy, but clear that this is the most taxing of the trilogy. Funny enough, the cinematic skills that hurt the frame rate on Switch 2 in Rebirths 1 and 2, like Little IF's Demon Summon, actually runs really well and smooth in Rebirth 3, even on the Switch 1. The real problem isn't frame rate, but the fact that it's very glitchy when played on the Switch 2. On stream last week and on my own time, I ran into a couple different glitches several times apiece. The first glitch has the game go to a black screen seemingly at random, sometimes when you're going through a dungeon, going through a menu, or in the middle of a boss fight, specifically the Anana Death rematch. The game is still running and you can still hear the game, navigate around by ear, and if you transition to a cutscene, the visuals will return, but it'll be all glitched up, showing distorted text boxes for damage numbers, names, and anything in the UI. You have to actually close and restart the game to fix it. The second bug causes the world map screen to replace the actual map with a black screen with weird fog moving around. Like the other glitch, you can still play the game like this, but you have to close and restart for it to return to normal. As I said a moment ago, this is a Switch 2 problem. One of these happens every couple hours when I play this game on the Switch 2, while I play the entire second half of the game exclusively on Switch 1 and never ran into either of them even once. It's possible that a future Switch 2 OS update might be able to fix this, like it fixed Mugen Souls 1's crashing issues on Switch 2, though it is worth noting that the recently released 21.0 update did not. So be wary and save often if you're playing on the new platform. And that brings us to battery life. Rebirth 3 gives the original and light models a range of about 3.5 to 5 hours. The V2 and OLED models get 6 to 8 hours, and the Nintendo Switch 2 gets about 3 hours and 10 minutes. In conclusion, the Neptunia Rebirth trilogy on Switch is now complete, bringing the biggest and most mature of the games to the hybrid systems, at least in Asia. Now, the downside bugs make the Switch 2 much smoother but unpredictable, giving you a choice of a bugless but constantly choppy Switch 1 experience versus a smoother but buggy Switch 2 one. It's a great RPG, but be wary that you might get a boss or dungeon turning into a black screen, causing you to either redo progress or navigate by ear to get yourself saved to restart. Reviews to go rates Neptunia Rebirth 3 V Generation for the Nintendo Switch a 7 out of 10. If you're interested in more Neptunia content, check out my Switch review of Rebirth 1. And if you like the content, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.